I would like to continue our lessons in ministerial development today by talking about the minister's family relationships. We find in 1 Timothy chapter 3, also Titus 1, the guidelines or qualifications for ministers. And among those guidelines, we see the role of the family quite prominently. Let's take a look quickly. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife. And I'm using the New King James here. Notice it doesn't require that the minister be male or married, but it's using the typical case. If a minister is married, then that minister should follow Christian guidelines for morality and marriage. That is, being faithful to one spouse. But then notice also in verse 4, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? And then verse 7 also speaks of having a good testimony among those who are outside. So here we see it's quite important for the minister to have the proper role in marriage and family life. Now, this is not an absolute statement that no matter what the circumstances of a minister's family, that they have to fit a certain mode, but it's talking about having a good reputation and having good leadership skills as demonstrated in the home, and having proper relationships and proper priorities in family life. Sometimes there's a thought that ministry comes first, family comes second. I don't think that's the way we should look at it. Our personal relationship with God certainly comes first. Even if our family is opposed to us serving God, we must serve the Lord. However, when we make God our number one priority, He in turn bids us to be a good father or mother, a good husband or wife, a good Christian. So before we are ministers, before we are preachers, we are Christians. And that means before we are ministers or preachers, we are good fathers and mothers, husbands and wives. Serving God encompasses having good family relationships according to the will of God. So we should not pit serving God against family relationships or family responsibilities, but they're all interwoven together. And I would say this, we are Christians before we are preachers. Therefore, we must take care of our personal and family responsibilities. We cannot neglect them using ministry as a reason or an excuse. God does not want us to have to choose between our family responsibilities and our church or ministry responsibilities. But if it came to a situation where we either need to sacrifice our family to pursue ministry or sacrifice ministry to pursue family, I think we must first do everything we can to fulfill our family responsibilities. And I believe God will open appropriate doors for ministry if we keep God first, our personal relationship with God first, but then our life as Christians and our life as family members second, or in close harmony, because after all, these relationships are God's will for our lives, and to be successful and biblical in these relationships is God's will. And then ministry opportunities will unfold. We shouldn't have to sacrifice our family for the sake of ministry, but we should ask God to give us the ability to minister in the context of effective family relationships. And that's exactly what we see in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Also, there's a parallel passage in Titus chapter 1, which I'll briefly refer to, that for an elder, the elder must be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. Now, we understand that adult children who have moved away from the home, or teenage or adult children who are acting outside the home, a minister cannot be 100% responsible or accountable. But to the extent that he has control of those children, they should reflect the leadership that he expresses. And if he is not effective in Christian leadership in his own home, where he does have jurisdiction, where he does have authority, then There's a question as whether he can be effective in leadership outside the home in Christian ministry. These statements underscore the importance of our family relationships. They're not to bring condemnation. None of us is perfect in our relationships or in the exercise of our responsibilities, but we can be good Christians in these family relationships, and we can be good examples to the church, and that's what we should strive to do. Even in trial or adversity, even when we're having a struggle with a teenage or adult child, still we can model Christian leadership, Christian ethics, and Christian responsibility in those cases. We must be an example to the believers and to the church if we're going to be successful in leadership. Now let's focus on our family life and first of all, our marriage. In consideration of a minister's marriage, let me emphasize 5 things: love, communication, time, sensitivity, and encouragement. Let me also give you scripture in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, which applies to all marriages, but particularly I think it's worthy of considering in the minister's marriage. And that is, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Notice that if there's something wrong in our marriage relationship, that will affect our relationship with God. That's why I said it's wrong to say ministry comes first and then family or marriage comes second. Actually, serving God is always first, but included in serving God is a right relationship with our family members, and in this case particularly the right relationship of husband and wife. If we are not treating our spouse as God wants us to treat our spouse, then we're hindering our own relationship with God, and even more, we're hindering our ministry. So if we want to have a good relationship with God and effective ministry, then we certainly need to pay attention to our marriage. And of course, the number one reason to pay attention to our marriage is not simply for the sake of effective ministry, but for the sake of the marriage itself. And so I go back to 5 things that we need to pay special attention to if we're going to have a successful marriage, particularly in the context of ministry. Ministry places lots of stress upon a marriage relationship. So that relationship must be founded upon love. We must take time to love one another, to express our love, and to do what 1 Corinthians 13 talks about when it describes love. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. A study of that chapter will go a long way toward helping us understand what a loving relationship is supposed to be in God's plan. We must take time to cherish our spouse and make our spouse the priority of our personal life alongside our relationship with God. The second thing is communication. If a marriage has good communication, then the partners can deal with every problem that comes up and overcome successfully. But if there are communication problems in marriage, then every problem, even trivial ones, can become major. I'll talk more about communication in a few minutes. And then third, time. You cannot build a relationship without investing a lot of time. And yes, it's important to have quality time, but you cannot simply say, well, I have limited amounts of time, but they're always quality. You must have a quantity of time. There must be an attention both to quality and quantity. You must carve out time. You must make time. You must set times in your calendar for your wife or husband and for your children and for the family as a whole. You can't leave it to chance or happenstance. You can't keep shoving it off, but you've got to carve out times where you're able to spend together. And then sensitivity. It's important not simply to talk, to communicate, but to be sensitive to the needs and feelings of the other person, to take time to think about what the other person is interested in or concerned about, to be empathetic, put yourself in the other person's shoes. And then finally, encouragement. one of the great benefits of marriage, and especially in the ministry context, is that when one is discouraged, the other one can be encouraged. But if both are discouraged, then you really do have a problem. So when you detect that your spouse is struggling or discouraged or frustrated or upset, try to be the person that encourages and lifts up. Don't pile in with more gloom and doom, but let God use you to encourage your spouse. And then in turn, of course, there will be many times when your spouse makes a big difference in your own life to encourage you. Now let me move on, talking about the children. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, we have an important admonition when it comes to parents and their children. Of course, the Bible speaks of children obeying their parents, but there's a relationship, there's a responsibility that parents owe, particularly fathers. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Fathers and mothers are to train and nourish their children, to care and provide for them, not only physically and emotionally, but of course spiritually. And in that regard, even though they have this responsibility to train, to discipline, to correct, they must do it in love. They must do it with appropriate boundaries. They cannot be physically or emotionally or verbally abusive. They should not create conditions which would cause their children to respond in wrath. Of course, children aren't going to always be happy with their parents' decisions, but we should think carefully as parents about our own attitude, our own responses, our own ways of communication with our children, that we do not provoke them, that we do not push their buttons, but in turn, we are the adults in the relationship. We are the mature ones, that we're careful not to discipline in anger, not to express hatred or contempt, or not to tear down or to put down, not to provoke our children to respond in the wrong type of ways, but to respond in love. And of course, when we model love, care, kindness, respect for our children, then they will learn to have that kind of love and respect for us as well as other people. And this principle is true for all families, but especially for the minister and the pastor, who is supposed to be a role model for the saint. As a minister, it's very important how you treat your children with regard to your ministry. Many preachers' kids grow up to resent the ministry, to resent the demands and the sacrifices that the family has to participate in, and to resent the people of the church who may be hypocritical or who may criticize the pastor and his family. How the minister and how the pastor deals with his ministry determines to a great extent how the children will respond to ministry and respond to the church and even to the Lord. I think it's important for a minister to include his children in his ministry as a natural part of the ministry. Include them in ministry-related activities as a family. The minister should not project some sense of resentment or bitterness, or that it's a great imposition or sacrifice to do the work of the Lord. But instead, the minister should treat it as a holy calling, as a privilege, as a normal way of life. And so he or she includes his children in the normal activities of family life and includes ministry as part of that. However, the minister should not pressure his children into a calling. I don't believe it's appropriate to ever try to train someone to feel a call to preach or put an expectation on them that they should become a preacher. Yes, I think we should keep an openness and ask our children to keep an openness to the call of God. But we should never presume that they're going to be preachers. We should never take it for granted that they're going to follow in our footsteps, or we should not imply that that's what we want more than anything else. Instead, the proper attitude is we want you to be who God calls you to be. I will be pleased with you, I will be proud of you, I will be thankful for you, not if you become a preacher, but if you serve God and if you fulfill the calling that God has placed in your life, whether it be a preacher or whether it be a faithful member of a church, whether it be in a profession or a career or a vocation or a job where you're faithful to God, support the church, are involved in the activities and ministries of the church, or whether you are a full-time preacher. It doesn't matter as far as my love for you and my approval for your life. We've got to communicate that so that there's no pressure. We must keep in mind that the church is not a family business. It's not a hereditary kingdom. We don't have the right to pass on a church to our children or in-laws, but we are accountable to God, and our children must be accountable to God for their own lives. We should not make special impositions upon them because they are preachers' kids. Yes, there will be special sacrifices, but we should offset that with special privileges. Anytime our kids start talking about the ministry or the church in a negative way, we must counterbalance that by saying, well, there may be some things you have to sacrifice because you're a preacher's kid. There may be some things we have to do that are different from other families. We may have to invest more time. Our calendar may be different. The way we schedule things may be different. But on the other hand, you get a lot of special privileges that the average kid probably doesn't get. You get to travel. You have different experiences. You meet different kinds of people. You see the miracle-working power of God from up close. You see how God works. You are part of revival. You're part of growing a church or starting a church. You have many advantages. You learn more. You're exposed to more. So even though there are disadvantages, there are also advantages. And on the whole, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And we should not appeal to our children to do things because they're the preacher's kid or the pastor's kid, although sometimes it's very tempting to do that. But we should appeal to them to do things because they are Christians and because this is what our family believes and practices. So if we don't want them to participate in something, or if we do want them to participate in something, it shouldn't be, well, I'm the pastor, so you need to do this, or you can't do this, or the church won't like this, or people won't like this. But it should always be, this is the choice our family has made. This is the choice we make as Christians. This is what we have decided to do as a family. And as long as you're part of the family, you'll follow our family's teachings. We are dedicated to serving the Lord. So don't spoil them, but don't discipline them excessively. Try to treat them with balance as Christians. Yes, we need to discipline with them when they're wrong, but we discipline them as Christians. We hold them to a standard of what our family teaches and what the church teaches for everyone. If they're doing wrong, yes, the people of the church have the right and responsibility to bring that to our attention, or if they're in certain aspects of leadership, such as a Sunday school teacher or youth director, then they have the same authority to deal with our child as they would any other child. But they shouldn't discipline them excessively because they're the preacher's kid, and they should never tell them, you should be ashamed of yourself, you're the preacher's kid. So we have to teach our people and teach our leaders not to use the preacher's kid status either to discipline them or punish them excessively, or to spoil them and give them special advantages. Yes, they are going to get certain blessings, but we should not raise them in a prima donna situation. We should not raise them to expect special favors, to expect the limelight, to expect to always get the best parts and the best things the church has to offer. But as much as possible, treat them as just like anyone else in the church, and give other children and other young people the same types of opportunities that we give our children. So yes, we need to give our children special opportunities, but we need to be sensitive to give others the same type of opportunities based on their own dedication to God, based on their own merits and gifts, so that our children don't get a sense that they are better than everybody else. We don't want to spoil them or think that they have special exceptions that nobody else has. We hold them to the same standard as everyone else. We give them the same opportunities as everyone else. We don't allow them to be treated as favorites or to be penalized because of their status. This will help them to become mature, well-rounded Christians who participate in the church. Now, let me briefly talk about some principles for good communication, which will help us in our family life, will help us in our relationship with our spouses, and also with our children. I'll just briefly touch on this. But good communication is based on trust, mutual trust. It's based on honesty. That doesn't mean you have to be rude or crude or say something hateful just because you believe it or just because it's true. But it means you can't lie to one another. You have to be honest. You have to be open. You have to be kind. So we balance the need for honesty with the need for consideration and tact, considering the feelings of the other person. And as I mentioned, we must allow time and opportunity. Some things cannot be planned. You just must spend enough time together. You must plan enough unstructured time, enough quantity of time, so that quality opportunities for communication will emerge naturally. You cannot simply say, well, I've got limited time, I've got 30 minutes, so let's have high quality, intense communication today. It doesn't always happen that way. But as you spend time together with those you love, then natural opportunities for good communication will arise spontaneously, sometimes when you least expect them. But there are certain occasions when you need to schedule time for communication without distraction. Go on a date, or take a time with each child individually, or take time as a family together. There have got to be those planned and unplanned times when good communication can take place. And in all communication, we've got to learn to pay attention, to really listen, not simply responding to the words, not simply arguing back and forth, but understanding the message that the person is trying to convey. Understand the underlying feelings and the underlying intention behind the communication. Now, that's especially true in our marriage relationship. We've got to understand the difference between men and women. That men, this is somewhat of a generalization or stereotype, but sometimes men approach things from the point of view of, I'm going to solve the problem, where a woman is not necessarily wanting the man to give her the answer to all her problems, but wanting simply to listen and to be empathetic. And the woman wants to express her feelings and for her husband to understand and sympathize and empathize with those feelings. In other words, she's wanting him to respond emotionally as well as rationally. And she's wanting feelings of romance, where a man often is focused on physical attraction. There needs to be a balance. So in a good relationship between husband and wife, there needs to be the holistic approach, meeting the whole needs of one another. And there must be an ability to express our feelings without violating a sense of security. Now, in that context, let me give you 13 rules for fighting fair. I put fighting in quotes because obviously we don't believe in actual fighting. But the point is, there are going to be disagreements in every marriage and in every relationship. If there never is any disagreement, then probably only one person is doing the thinking. The point is, we can't and shouldn't try to eliminate all differences of opinion, but we need to learn how to handle them in a mature and productive and constructive fashion. So let me briefly mention these. Number one, do not yell, scream, or use harsh or offensive language. That should go without saying, but as Christians, we need to remind ourselves. Number two, never resort to physical violence or intimidation. Number three, do not withhold physical intimacy. That cannot be a weapon in our disagreements. Number four, do not attack one another. Instead, speak about feelings and needs. Instead of saying, you did this, you did that, phrase it in terms of yourself. I thought this, I felt this. That opens the opportunity to discuss. The other person may say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't intend for you to feel this way. So instead of blaming, you're inviting discussion. Number 5 is related to that. Do not accuse one another of character flaws. Speak about specific actions or problems. So don't say you never do this or you always do that. That's an attack on their character, on who they are. Instead, deal with a specific situation. Here's what concerned me. Here's what I was upset about. Can we work on this specific behavior or this specific incident? Number 6, do not discuss matters over which the other person has little or no control. If you attack and criticize their appearance, what are they supposed to do about that? They have only a limited ability to respond. Number 7, do not raise issues that have been resolved in the past. Once you've discussed something thoroughly, once you've apologized, you've repented, you've prayed together, you've worked it out, you've accepted one another's explanation, then don't bring it up later as a fresh argument or when something else happens to read a list of wrongs and bring up things that have already been resolved. Number 8, do not fight in front of other people, especially your own children. You've got to learn to deal with differences individually and personally. Don't use public discussions, even in the form of jokes, as a jab at your spouse. Number 9, do not humiliate. That's related to number 8. One of the worst things that you can do is to openly belittle or demean or contradict your spouse in public in a form that would humiliate them, perhaps in front of the whole church or in front of a friend. Number 2, speak from facts, not assumptions, suspicion, jealousy, or rumor. So often we jump to conclusions. Why is it that someone that we really love and we've had experience with for years and we found them to be trustworthy, yet one simple statement or one questionable thing from a stranger or an acquaintance can suddenly cause us to be suspicious? We've got to learn to hold down those emotional reactions and make sure we're speaking from facts, make sure we give the other person the benefit of the doubt, make sure we know what we're really talking about before we try to deal with an issue. Number 11, think before you speak and take a time out if necessary. Sometimes we get so emotional in our discussion that we're not making any progress. At that time, either party should have the right to say, let's take a time out. We will talk about it, but let's go. I need to go for a walk, or I need to go for a drive, or I need to pray, or I need to counsel with someone, or let's pick this up tomorrow when we have more time, when we're calmed down. Either person needs to be able to say that, and the other person will not harass them or press them, but leave it alone. This can't be a cop-out for not dealing with issues, but simply agreeing to wait until both sides have calmed down and can think more rationally and less emotionally about the situation. Number 12, kiss and make up. Ephesians 4:26 says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. If at all possible, any disagreement needs to be resolved that day before you go to bed. Even if the underlying decision or problem cannot be resolved, you should be able to say at the end of the day, I'm sorry we had this agreement. I love you. We're going to work it out. It's going to take some time to work it out. We're going to have to talk tomorrow. We're going to have to get advice. But I just want you to know that I love you and I'm sorry for what I've said or done. I want us to be friends. I want us to love one another. And we can do that. If we do that each day, we'll protect our relationship. We'll protect our emotional and physical intimacy, our spirituality, and arguments don't have to be destructive. But if we don't do that, then arguments develop into grudges or long-standing battles, and they become more difficult to resolve. And then finally, pray together. If we learn to pray together, and we are vulnerable to one another, and each other can hear our sincere expressions to God, then that's going to go a long way toward building and retaining trust. And then, of course, God answers prayer. So when we pray together, He intervenes and our relationship becomes much greater than it would have been otherwise. In summary, the minister has to take care of family relationships. First of all, because the minister is a Christian. And second of all, If we don't take care of family relationships, they will hinder or even destroy our ministry. But if we do have good family relationships, they will be a great blessing in every aspect of our ministry.